presidential elections. During the Obama years, for example, the Democratic Party lost roughly 1,000 seats in state legislatures in this country. Republicans now hold have two-thirds of our state legislatures, two-thirds of the governorships, and they control half of the states outright. Democrats only control 7 states. So whatever the liberal message has been, it's been rejected by a vast majority of Americans, I think, or at least a vast group that we need to attract again. And so we've steadily lost face, so to speak, before the American public. Liberal has become a dirty word, and even when Democrats propose policies that people like, as soon as they're labeled liberal or democratic, people reject them. So clearly we've lost the contest for the American imagination.
And it's interesting that that's happened because, of course, what are we now, 56, 57 years removed from probably the greatest inaugural ever. It was the Democrat President John Kennedy who said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country." I guess today it's, what does my country owe me by virtue of my identity? And I guess we need to know a little more about how we got, or how your party, I guess, got from there to here.
Well, part of it is, I think, a fixation on movement politics as opposed to party politics. After George McGovern's election, what had been the new left in this country retreated to universities and became important in the Democratic Party. And their conception of politics essentially was that parties don't work. For anything to change in this country, you need social movements. Now, there was a period in American history where all the great reforms that took place through movement politics and not through party politics. And so during that period, we got civil rights, we got the women's movement, the early women's movement, and the early gay rights movement. But ever since 1980, all the action has been on the Republican side, and they've focused on building a party from the grassroots up. And we've not done that. And it's in the nature of movement politics to focus on one particular issue rather than, a whole host of issues, and to become ever more extreme in the demands, and there are internal fights over who's the most pure. And that kind of thinking and those habits are bad habits and bad thinking for really building a democratic majority. And the perversity of it, and this is a big theme in the book, the perversity of it is that we are less and less able to protect the groups whom these groups say that they represent because we do not have institutional power. Institutional power can trump movement power every time. And so there needs to be a new way of thinking about how to invest our energies on the liberal side of the spectrum.
As we try to understand this phenomenon better, I'd like you to compare and contrast two terms that you use in your book and help us understand how they are different. You talk about the Roosevelt and the Reagan dispensation. Help us understand that better.
Well, one way of dividing up 20th century political history is to think of two dispensations. Now, the word dispensation, those of your viewers who dabble in Protestant theology will know what I mean. A dispensation, like the Old Testament dispensation, New Testament dispensation, means that certain rules apply. And from the New Deal, up until the 1970s, certain rules applied. The Democratic Party spoke about solidarity and equal rights. It had a robust sense of what government could do to guarantee those things. And it really set the terms of political debate, so much so that Republicans had to respond in like terms. So, for example, Richard Nixon proposed a guaranteed minimum income. He also proposed national health insurance, but he wanted Republican versions of those. So in a sense, the terms of debate had been set by the New Deal. with the election of Reagan, the terms of debate shifted. Government began to look incompetent or illegitimate. The focus became on economic growth. Government became the problem. Individual effort and initiative was praised and idealized. The picture of the country was of individuals and their families and maybe in their social groups and churches, but not a country of citizens engaged in a common political effort. And in a sense, Democrats had to adapt to that as well. So it was Bill Clinton who said that the age of big government is over. And both he and Barack Obama focused heavily on economic growth. So the terms of debate have been set by the Republicans, and that's been very frustrating for the progressive wing of the Democratic Party because it has meant that there's not been a focus on protecting jobs and unions and the like. Now, my view is that these two dispensations are now over, that Donald Trump actually brought an end to the Reagan dispensation, not by moving further to the left or further to the right, but by coming up from below. And now we're left with two visions of America, the Roosevelt one and the Reagan one, and neither one is compelling to most Americans anymore. We're living in a vision-free era in the United States, and that, I think, creates an opportunity for both sides. I think that whichever side is the first to offer a hopeful, compelling vision of American destiny that people can recognize themselves in will be able to determine the shape of American politics in the coming decades.
What I found interesting about that answer, though, is that despite 8 years of Clinton and 8 years of Obama, you don't seem to think that, unless I'm inferring incorrectly here, you don't seem to think those two presidents pursued a truly liberal agenda. And, to be sure, if you watch a lot of American media, I mean, these guys are the closest things to democratic Marxist socialists there are out there. So figure that all out for me, if you would.
Well, I would not at all call them Marxist socialists. I teach political theory for a living, and those words have a very specific meaning for me. What I'm saying is that even when they wanted to pursue more classic liberal goals, they had to cast it in terms that were not those of the Roosevelt era, but rather in terms of empowering individuals and empowering families. What dropped out during the Reagan dispensation was any talk on both sides of public duty, of what we owe to each other. The rhetoric was about rights and not about sacrifice. Republicans got us involved in many wars, but they never imposed a sacrifice on American citizens because they understood that would break their view of the country. And Democrats have not been speaking about duty. They only speak about rights and the rights of particular groups in particular. So the idea that we owe something to our country has dropped out. And so, the American presidency doesn't matter as much as Americans think and certainly as foreigners think. President can propose, but a Congress can dispose, Supreme Court can dispose, and state and local governments can fail to enforce and enact things that are passed at the federal level. And so that's why the thinking needs to focus on not the presidency, but about rebuilding a party with a message that reaches people in all walks of life in the country.
I take your point on that, but, unless I missed it, you don't have a lot of good things to say about Barack Obama in the book. And, notwithstanding that, certainly from north of the border, the view on Obama was that he was, I think overwhelmingly most Canadians thought he was a pretty progressive president. Obamacare is in. It refuses to die, despite the efforts of the current president and some in the Congress. Don't you consider that a significant liberal achievement?
I do. It's a huge liberal achievement. The problem was that his intentions were very progressive. The problem is that the country wasn't there. And so even when he proposed, he had to get things through Congress. It had to pass muster with the Supreme Court, and that was very difficult. So he was not able to pursue many of the things that he wanted to pursue. I have no problem with Barack Obama's presidency. He was simply not able to achieve as much as he needed to achieve, and I think he would put it this way, because the Republicans have dominated the public